Hi class. So just going to give you a little bit more background about runaway sexual selection because I had to go through it pretty quickly today, and it's a complicated enough topic that I want you to be able to listen to this a few times if you need to be sure you really understand this. And so runaway sexual selection is often called Fisherian sexual selection or the sexy son model. But this idea here is that these are arbitrary displays that provide no information about male quality or health or direct benefits to the female. So these are not indicator signals. The display traits that the males have are not indicator traits. But they can evolve because of mating advantages achieved by sons. So females who have this preference have sexy sons. And so this idea was proposed by Ronald Fisher in 1930. So the way that this works is that if we assume that we have some females out there that have a genetic preference, so it has to have a genetic basis, for males that have some sort of a display trait that also has to have a genetic basis. So both of these have to be genetic and they have to be heritable. And so this could be a display trait, could be song or plumage or color or dance, whatever else, right? And so if there's a preference, then males that have the signal that taps into that preference, the preferred trait, are going to have a mating advantage because there's females out there. And so males that sing, for example, can mate with females who prefer a singing male and females who couldn't care less. They can mate with both types of females. But non-singing males can only mate with non-choosy females. And so singing males have an advantage just because there's a preference out there in the population. So that's one key component of how this works. The next key component is the genetic benefit to females. So when I first introduced the idea of intersexual selection and the alternative models, I talked about how there's the direct benefit models, which are basically, these are the simplest ones, right? By choosing a particular male, a female may gain access to a high quality territory or may gain food, or males may contribute parental care. There's lots of different direct things that females can get. And I contrasted that with indirect benefit models or genetic benefit models. Those are two interchangeable terms. And so these genetic benefit models include the good genes model and the runaway model. And so the good genes model is simply, in both of those cases, both good genes and runaway, females are making choices so that they get genes for their offspring that are in some way advantageous. And in the good genes model, those genes are advantageous because her kids are going to be healthier. Her daughters and sons are going to be healthier because they get these genes. Whereas in the runaway model, those genes are advantageous not because they make the kids healthier, but because the sons are sexier. So that's the genetic benefit that drives the runaway sexual selection model. So females with the preference gene have sons that have the sexy trait gene, right? So females are going to mate with males that have this preference gene, and therefore their kids are going to have the preference and the trait, right? So the males are going to express this sexy trait gene, this display gene, and they're also going to be carriers for the preference gene. And this is where this linkage disequilibrium or genetic correlation comes into play, because males that have this sexy signal are also going to be carriers for the preference gene. Just because of the fact that females with the preference are more likely to mate with males with the display, we're going to find those two genes correlated, right? We're going to find that they are more often than expected by chance found in the same individuals. And so these males who have the sexy traits and are carriers for the preference are going to mate a lot because they're sexy. So these sexy sons are going to mate a lot and they're going to have lots and lots of kids, and those kids are going to inherit both the preference and the trait. So the trait, the display trait, is evolving because it gives the male a mating advantage. That's the easy part to explain. Males that have the signal that's preferred mate more. That's easy to explain. The tough part is explaining how female preference evolves. And in this particular model, the preference evolves because it basically hitchhikes along with selection on the signal. The signal is attractive, it spreads because of that mating advantage, and as it spreads, it's dragging the preference along with it, right? So it spreads through the sons, rather than through the female herself, right? She doesn't have higher fitness. It's the fact that her sons mate more and pass on her genes that is really the mating advantage. And so that component of it is really the key to Runaway, is that the preference spreads through the sexy sons, not because it gives a fitness advantage directly to the female herself. As the preference becomes more common, that mating advantage grows because you have more and more females who are only going to mate with males with a signal, and so males with a signal are going to do even better, and males without the signal are going to do even worse. So that mating advantage expands, and then we end up with this positive feedback loop. So positive feedback keeps running away, and it's going to spread both the preference and the trait throughout the population at an accelerating pace. And that's that idea of Runaway. And it can't go on infinitely. At some point, the survival cost is going to outweigh the mating benefits, right? You can't have an infinitely long tail if that's what the females are preferring, is a longer and longer tail. At some point, it just can't get any longer. And so the survival cost is going to outweigh that benefit. And that at that point, it'll stop continuing to elaborate, but we're still left with a very elaborated display trait and a female preference for it. So it may no longer be running away, but it is now very, very large display trait. And so this may be how a lot of these signals come about. So here's a cheesy example using peacock spiders. And first, let me just say that this is a grossly oversimplified example. I'm trying to keep everything very basic here so that you can see the process in this simplest form. And so what I'm really trying to illustrate with this is the fact that as soon as you have a female preference out there, males that have a trait that corresponds to that preference have an immediate mating advantage. That's the first thing to illustrate. And then the second thing to illustrate is the fact that you can have selection favoring the spread of the preference gene through the population. So it's going to increase in frequency in the population. The alleles that encode for this preference can increase in the population even if all the females have identical fitness. So normally those kinds of traits would spread because the bearers have higher fitness and they pass on their genes. But in this case, the females all have the same fitness, but the differences in fitness among males are what causes the preference gene to spread. So the preference is spreading through the males, and so is the trait. So that's the key thing to watch for in this illustration. Okay, so we're going to assume that we are jumping into this whole scenario after this process is already underway. So this is not the very beginning of this population. This is not the very beginning of the Fisherian process or runaway sexual selection process. We are looking at a snapshot that's right in the middle of this process. Okay, so we're going to assume this is generation 5. And on the left, we have the males. And we are going to assume here they are doing their little dance. We are going to assume that we begin with 20% of the males have whatever trait that the females are interested in, and 80% of the males don't have the trait. So none of these guys are producing the sound. We're going to assume that sound is what females have this preference for. And on the female side, we have 40% of females who prefer sounds. They're the blue ones here, whereas the rest of the females don't care. They couldn't care less. They're going to mate randomly with respect to this particular trait. And so that's where we begin. And we're going to assume that all of the offspring of any male that has this signal are going to have the signal also. So they're going to inherit the signal from the father, and that they're also going to have the preference gene. And that's because these males can be carriers for the preference gene, because they came about from the previous generation as somebody else's sexy sons, right? So they have both the trait and they are carriers for the preference. They're males, so they don't express the preference, but they are carriers for it. And so let's let everybody mate. So we'll get started, and here our females are going off to select their mates, and all the females who have a preference for the sound mate with males who make the sound. The rest of the females mate randomly. So they've all randomly chosen their mates. And you can see here that the males that have the signal that's interesting, in this case sound, have a mating advantage. They mated more. So they mated with all the females who had a preference. They all went to just these males that had the traits. Plus, we have this one female here who was mating at random and just happened to end up mating with one of the males who had the signal. And so these guys have had a mating advantage, and their genes are going to be overrepresented in the next population. And those genes include genes for the trait, the signal in this case, as well as the preference. Okay, so let's just assume that all females are going to have 100 offspring. So they all have identical fitness, and all the offspring from males with the trait have both the trait from the male and the preference. And they can get that directly from their mom or from the male if he's a carrier, or they get one preference allele for both. And so they get the preference from both sides, right? So they can get the preference either through the male or from their mom, or for both. Okay, so now we are going to create our next generation. So these 500 spiderlings will all have genes for the traits and the preferences, whereas the other 500 spiderlings will not. So they will have alleles that don't encode for either the trait or the preference. And so now we can see that the next generation is going to be different than generation 5. So let's go to generation 6. And generation 6, we're now going to have 50% of the males have the trait and 50% don't have the trait. On the female side, we're going to see 50% of the females have the trait and 50% of the females don't have the trait. Okay, and so we've gone from, we had 20/80 among males, and we've gone to 50/50. And among females, we've gone from 60/40 to 50/50, right? So we've had an increase in the representation of both the trait and the preference in this population. So now we'll let this population mate, and all of them are going to run over and mate with who they want to mate with. And again, all the females who preferred the sound found the sound. And a few females that were mating at random ended up mating with males who had that signal. And so males with the signal have a mating advantage compared to males that don't have the signal. And again, these 700 spiderlings will have genes for both the trait and the preference, right? So if they mate with a male who has that trait, they're going to have kids that have both the preference and the trait, okay? So the other 300 spiderlings are not. They are going to have alleles that don't encode for any preference or any sound trait. Okay, so now let's look at generation 7. And in generation 7, we have males. 70% of the males have the trait and 30% of the males don't have the trait. And for females, we have 70% of the females who have the preference allele and 30% don't have the preference. And so in this extreme case, our population of spiders has gone from 20% males with the trait, 40% females with the preference, to 70% males with the trait and 70% females with the preference in only 3 generations. This is a very extreme case. We don't expect it to be this quick in nature, right? 3 generations of spiders could happen over a month or 2. And we're not talking about that fast. This was a very extreme case where we were assuming that every single male who had the signal was a carrier for the preference. And that may not always be the case. There could be a genetic correlation, but it doesn't need to be that strong, for example. And you could also, we were also assuming that every female who had the preference only mated with males who had the signal. And that probably also wouldn't be that way in nature, right? You would also have just some sort of error. Preferences aren't usually that 100%, or maybe they wouldn't all find the males that had those traits. So there are a number of reasons why this is a very, very extreme case. But even so, we expect this process to be faster than normal adaptive evolution by natural selection, right? When we talk about things happening over evolutionary time, we're normally talking about things happening in hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of years. Whereas we expect this population, or I mean, this process if everything is lined up so that it can truly take off and run away, then we expect it to happen pretty quickly relative to other processes of adaptive evolution. And so again, the key thing is that with no increase in the number or survival of offspring, because all females had 100 spiderlings every time, regardless of which male they mated with, the preference spread in the population. And it spread not because those females had higher fitness, because they had that preference, because they all had the same fitness. It spread because females' sexy sons mated more, and they passed on both the trait and the preference. And as the preference spread, the benefit gets even bigger and the process accelerates. So selection acts directly on the male display trait, right? Males that have that trait have higher fitness. So selection is acting directly on that trait. And it's dragging along the preference. So the preference only increases because it's correlated with the trait that is under selection. So it's hitchhiking along with selection on that male signal. So again, the key feature of Fisherian runaway sexual selection model, the sexy son model, is that female preferences spread because they're associated with signal genes through this genetic correlation, this linkage disequilibrium, not because they're favored directly. And that is really the key difference from the good genes model, right? So in the good genes model, if a female mates with a male that has some sort of attractive display, he's got a really fancy dance and bright colors or whatever else, then in the good genes process, he would have traits that reflect something about his underlying quality. So males that dance better would maybe have a better immune system quality or higher mitochondrial function or better aerobic capacity or whatever else, right? So by mating with males that have that attractive display, she's going to have kids that have genes from that dad, and those kids are going to inherit the genes that allowed him to be healthy and robust, right? So she's going to have healthier kids. She might have more kids, or more of them that reach the point where they hatch, or more of them that reach the point where they fledge from the nest and go out into the world, or more that reach adulthood. But some measure of fitness for that female is increased. She has higher fitness because she is choosy. Whereas in the runaway model, she doesn't have higher fitness, right? That's not necessary for this process to happen. She has the same fitness, but her sons are sexy and they mate more and they pass on both the genes that encode for his sexy signal and the preference. And so we don't expect this to really work in every situation, right? So we don't expect this to work when, for example, the preference is costly for females to have. So you can imagine a female who has a preference for males that produce a song, and if there are very few males in the population who produce this song, then if she spends the whole breeding season wandering around looking for a singing male, never to find him, and then doesn't mate, then that preference is not going anywhere, right? That preference is going to get knocked back really, really quickly. Or even if she just expends a huge amount of energy looking for that male and then ends up having lower fitness because of it, then that's going to stop this process, right? It's not going to be able to spread if it's costly for females to have these preferences. And so we don't expect it to be something that we see everywhere. But in species like lekking species, where males puff up and strut around in a big open area and females can walk around and choose whoever their little hearts desire, that's when this kind of process could be really powerful, right? Because they all get to express this preference, and there's not a lot of selection that's kind of knocking that preference back. And so it has the potential to really take off. Another advantage of lekking species for this kind of process is that males who are sexy are really successful, right? So if you are the sexy guy on the lek that everyone wants to mate with, your fitness is astronomically high. So you're going to be passing on a lot of your genes to the next generation, and along with it, you're going to be passing on those preferences, right? And so in lekking species, that mating advantage to the males that have the trait is much, much bigger. If you're talking about a monogamous species, right? So this is a monogamous species. So as soon as the male mates with the first female, then he's out of the mating pool for that whole reproductive season, right? Both of them are going to go then raise their kids. He doesn't get a big mating advantage from having this sexy trait, right? And so if it's a monogamous species, you're just not going to have this kind of strong process where you can run away in lots of different directions and end up with all sorts of crazy traits. You can have some Fisherian selection, but it's not going to be anywhere near as strong. So lekking species, for a variety of reasons, are really where we expect this kind of process to be strongest. That doesn't mean that all the signals we see in lekking species are Fisherian traits. In fact, I think there's probably a combination of good genes and Fisherian traits and other processes that we aren't going to have time to talk about in this class. But nonetheless, that's really where we expect this process to be most powerful. And so how do these things get started? You can have exploitation of a weak or rare pre-existing preference. And so we talked about sensory exploitation earlier, and the true process of sensory exploitation, that whole idea is that the preference is already there, and so the signal, some mutation pops up and allows a male to have that signal, and then the signal spreads and exploits that pre-existing preference. So that's the classic sensory exploitation model. And so what we're talking about here is that you can start out with some weak pre-existing preference or a rare pre-existing preference. So rather than everybody already having this preference, we could just have a few females that have this preference that comes about for some other reason, right? Through some feeding preference or through just a byproduct of their sensory system or whatever else. And it may take off by runaway. So that might just be what gets the ball rolling. Or it may be just a really weak tendency to mate with a particular kind of male, but it's enough to just get the ball rolling, and then it can evolve by this Fisherian process. So that's not exactly sensory exploitation anymore, right? Sensory exploitation was that the preference was already there entirely from the very beginning. Whereas runaway, we're saying this is a co-evolutionary process where the traits and the traits and the preferences co-evolve together, but they can get started through some weak pre-existing version of this. You can also have elaboration of an initially advantageous male trait. So this could be a male trait that started as an indicator of good genes. So she may have initially had a preference for some male display trait that was an indicator of quality, and that's what caused the initial evolution of that preference, because females that mated with those males had higher fitness, and so the preference starts evolving. And if we're a lekking species and everything is lined up to allow runaway to happen, then once that preference starts spreading in the population, it might just take off by runaway. So you're basically adding a jetpack to the process of good genes evolution. And it can take off, and it may no longer have any indicator value at some point, right? It may have just gotten started that way, but then it just went off on a tangent through runaway, right? So you're no longer going to keep that indicator value. You now have the trait just taking off through this process, this entirely Fisherian process. So that's another way that it might just get started, that just sort of jump starts the process. Or it could just be genetic drift. Just by chance alone, some female preference pops up, mutation causes a preference, and just through genetic drift, it starts spreading in the population. And if it gets common enough, it might start this process of runaway to just get it going in the first place. So what does this process predict? It predicts female preference for elaborate males. And again, that's not really a prediction of it's more of an assumption. Really, that's what we're fundamentally trying to explain when we're talking about intersexual selection and mate choice in general. We're trying to understand why female preference exists for elaborate males. But I have this listed here because if you were going to go out and try to study the process of sexual selection by Runaway or Good Genes or any of those models, the very first thing you would look for is there a female preference for elaborate males? If that's not there, then it's definitely not going to be Runaway, right? So this is a requirement for this process. We also have a prediction that male signals and female preferences are both heritable. So they have to have a genetic basis to both the preference and the trait. And that's not a unique prediction to Runaway. That is also true for the Good Genes model. But there has to be a genetic basis. And you have to have linkage disequilibrium, in other words, known as a genetic correlation between male signal and female preference. So you have to find those two things associated with each other more often than you would expect by chance. That is an absolute requirement for Runaway sexual selection to work. For the Fisherian model to work, we need a genetic correlation. But genetic correlations can also come about through good gene selection. And so this is a tough prediction because if you find this genetic correlation, it doesn't prove Runaway. It says that it could be either one of these traits. But what it does tell you is that if you don't find that genetic correlation, then you know it's not Runaway. It may still be Good Genes because Good Genes can still work without it, but Runaway requires it. So you would definitely need to find support for that in order to make a case that this is Runaway sexual selection. The main prediction of this Fisherian Runaway sexual selection is that female preferences are arbitrary, that they are not preferring signals that are indicators of anything. They are just things that for whatever reason females find attractive, and they're not indicators of anything. And so you shouldn't find a relationship between the expression of these male display traits and any underlying quality of interest. They shouldn't be indicator traits. And that's a tough prediction to test because there's tons of different things that signals can indicate. And so really to rule out the possibility that they're indicators, you'd almost have to test all possibilities. And so we're probably never going to do that and be totally satisfied that there's no chance that these are indicators. But if we don't have strong evidence that they are indicator traits, then it's, if we look for a few obvious examples where they might be indicators and we are not finding any evidence that they have anything to do with the health or quality of the offspring or anything like that, then we might be looking at a case where a Runaway is going on, or Runaway might be the best explanation for that evolution of that preference in that population. So many times when people are offering evidence for Runaway sexual selection, they'll just look at a group of birds like this. These are the birds of paradise, and just say, it has to be Runaway. I mean, look at how crazy these things are. Some common ancestor ended up in this part of the world and diversified into this crazy selection of different species of birds of paradise, all of whom have these totally over the top and weird ways of attracting mates, right? And so there has to be some component where this is just totally arbitrary, where it's just like fashion, right? Fashion can go off in tons of different directions, and it doesn't necessarily tell us anything like an indicator. It's just purely aesthetic. And so that would be the better analogy for this. And that's, it's not a terribly scientific argument to just say it has to be, right? So I don't find that alone very compelling. But on the other hand, if you look at this, you really do have to ask, how do we explain how things get that crazy? And Runaway does provide an easier explanation for that. It just says everything goes wherever it wants to go, and it's totally arbitrary. And yeah, Good Genes has a harder time explaining this kind of diversification, right? If you are relying entirely on the Good Genes model, then you'd be arguing that, for example, in that upper left bird, that having a 12-foot long tail is somehow the best way to indicate underlying health in that species, whereas the middle one on the bottom, the best way to indicate it is to have a 3-foot long feather sticking out of the side of your head that you whirl around in circles while you're jumping on a branch. And, it's hard to imagine why that would be the case. Why is it necessary to signal good genes one way in one species and totally different in another? And so that hypothesis alone is not very satisfying, good genes alone. But there are other aspects and other ways that we understand signal evolution that can help explain this. So sensory drive may play a role. The microhabitat and light environment may influence which signals are going to be most effective in that habitat, as we talked about earlier in the course. There's also alternative models of sexual selection that we just don't have time to talk about in this class. So there are some alternative models out there. If you're interested in this stuff, one of them is called mutation order selection. That I find that one particularly compelling. But in my personal opinion, so you don't need to know any of the stuff I'm talking about on the slide for the exam. This is just me talking about this stuff because it's what I study and I find it fascinating and I can't shut up when I'm thinking about this stuff. So my personal opinion of what's going on here is that we may have something like an adaptive underlying preference for making males do something really difficult, right? So if you look at across the different grouse species, including the sage grouse, females have a preference for males that do this really aerobically difficult thing. All morning long, they have to just dance like crazy. And then the females will mate with the male that does this best. And by doing that, they're probably getting a male that is very healthy, because you just can't do that unless you're healthy. And all the different grouse species, they look different, they dance different, they have all sorts of differences, but they all do something really hard. And in my mind, that's kind of an underlying adaptive preference, but the details of how it play out can be very, very different in these different species. And so the analogy I like to use for this is that we as humans, we have an adaptive preference for sweet and fatty foods. And this is adaptive because our ancestors who had this preference probably were able to store up more fat and, have more kids or feed their kids better or whatever else. And our taste for these foods has co-evolved with our ability to metabolize these foods, right? So not every species can taste sweet foods. So the fact that we have this is because we have evolved to have this. This is our aesthetic sense of what is delicious has been shaped over evolutionary time. But there are lots of different ways to tap into that preference, right? So we like sweet and fatty things, but there are lots of different kinds of cheesecakes out in the world that are extremely delicious. And they may all vary in terms of their color and their taste and their smell and their texture and their mouthfeel and all sorts of different aspects of the individual cheesecakes may differ, and some may be more effective at stimulating our preference than others, but all of them are delicious to us. And there's a lot of variation among those different individual recipes, but all of them are tapping into that same underlying adaptive preference. And that's kind of what I think about when I look at a situation like this. I think that there's probably this underlying female preference that is an adaptive preference that's probably closer to the good genes model, but the exact details of how it plays out in these different populations can be somewhat arbitrary. In all cases, females are demanding that the males do something crazy and intense and revealing of their underlying quality, but the details of how it plays out can be highly variable. So my view of all of this is actually some sort of hybrid between that sort of arbitrary component from Runaway, but also this underlying adaptive quality that is closer to good genes. To me, it's just a really interesting question, because it really gets at the heart of how does our sense of what is beautiful evolve? Why are some things aesthetically pleasing to us? So if you think that, that there is this underlying adaptive preference and there's lots of different ways to stimulate it, then why? Why do we find some things aesthetically intriguing and other things not at all? And so you're really fundamentally asking the question about how does beauty evolve and how does our sense of beauty evolve? So that's why it gets at that interface between art and biology that I find so very interesting because it's a pretty fundamental question about our interactions in the world. And so that is why I'm so fascinated by this topic. And so I directed you to this episode of Radiolab. It's not a very balanced episode. It's dominated by an interview with a guy named Rick Prum, who wrote a book that is proposing that really Runaway and Fisherian selection is the most and only important thing. And he thinks that those of us that think that there's something adaptive going on are totally boring and lame. And you will detect that hint in the Radiolab episode. But you've heard my perspective on it. And in the episode, I barely talk, but I did a lot of behind the scenes shaping of the narrative of the questions that they were asking Rick. But in the end, the episode is not terribly balanced. And that's why I just say that it's an okay episode of Radiolab, because it's not my favorite. So anyway, that is Runaway Sexual Selection, and please know that I will almost certainly ask you on the final exam to explain Runaway Sexual Selection. I don't expect you to draw an elaborate figure with lots of spiders and spiderlings and mating preferences and everything else. Just go through the notes and pull out the key features of Runaway, the importance of genetic correlations, those kinds of key things that I said over and over again as we were going through that model, and try writing it out as a paragraph explanation of Runaway, and make sure that you're touching on all of those key things, and that you can tell me what the difference between Runaway and good genes is. And so through all of this video, hopefully you will be able to glean that. And so good luck.